Hotel chains like Wyndham and Hilton were cautiously optimistic at the end of April that the consumer downturn they were seeing would only be short-lived. Management teams rushed to reassure investors that once the tariff matter got cleared up, Americans and their fellow travelers around the rest of the world would come rushing back. Even airlines were trying to make the same case because, after all, American consumer discretionary spending was always the one economic factor everyone could always depend upon. But as more data comes in, the evidence keeps proving it was no one-off. Now, the media keeps trying to sell this as tariff inflation, but the pricing data keeps showing there is no inflation, quite the opposite. So yesterday it was consumer prices, and today it's producer prices, though in this one, wholesalers got a whole bunch of negative numbers, deflationary conditions, and right in these key sectors tied to consumer discretionary spending. And remember, these figures are for June, so we're several months removed from the tariff delays and well within the stock market's roaring rebound. Share prices have priced a one-off in the economy, but the economic data keeps showing continuous signs instead for an inflection. As I said yesterday, the data shows consumers are more than cautious. They are cutting back, and that's what's forcing businesses to do the same thing. Even the energy demand data that we got from the government today shows a sizable drop in gasoline usage. Consumers are no longer flying, driving, or staying in hotels in the way that they used to. And that's forcing prices down in a way that doesn't align with a small little speed bump on the way to that mythical soft landing. Now, back at the end of April, when the company reported on its quarterly earnings, Hilton said, according to Reuters, Hilton Worldwide cut its forecast for 2025 room revenue growth on Tuesday, began back in April, becoming the first U.S.-based hotel operator to temper its outlook as consumer spending on travel takes a hit from a global trade war. It's not really a global trade war, it's the fragile, forgot-how-to-grow economy going too far. But continuing with the article, American consumers are growing cautious about discretionary spending such as travel after President Trump's sweeping tariffs and resulting trade war sparked fears of an economic recession. That's the weak economy encountering potentially a shock to many. Earlier this month, back in April, legacy U.S. carriers Delta Airlines, Southwest, and American had pulled their financial forecast for this year, 2025. Delta added that travel demand has, quote, largely stalled due to the economic uncertainty fueled by tariffs. And it was really about, as I keep saying, it's not about sentiment and pessimism for the sake of sentiment. It's not consumers overreacting to tariffs. It's been about jobs and incomes the entire time. And as I keep pointing out, we've got tons of data that shows incomes and jobs and the conditions in the labor market are increasingly worse. They're deteriorating, not staying steady, not solid, not reliable and resilient. And the warning, so to speak, from Hilton was echoed one day later on April 30th by Wyndham. Jeff Bellotti, who's the president and chief executive officer of Wyndham, said, "While the macro environment remains uncertain, we're staying focused on what we can control, investing in high-quality growth, executing with discipline, and supporting our franchisees. Our asset-light, franchise-only business model has consistently outperformed during economic downturns and positions us well to deliver long-term value for our shareholders through all phases of any economic cycle." So he was basically saying it without actually coming out and saying it. When you come out and tell shareholders and reassure them that we can perform in any economic environment, including downturns, what you're really saying is, we're seeing a downturn, so don't worry about it, we'll be just fine in it. I mean, when you're reassuring investors you know how to perform during a recession, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what you're expecting from the macroeconomic environment. It's not good, to say the least. And on the quarterly earnings call, Bellotti said, "We're optimistic, and I think our franchisees are as well, that the uncertainty that's out there could be relatively short-lived." And that's what everyone has been saying. We're going to hit a rough spot in the short run because of consumer quote-unquote uncertainty and then some pessimism that we're picking up in all these surveys. But then it will all go away, especially as we now have trade delays going on, trade deals that are happening, and the stock market has come roaring back from the ashes to fly to all-time record highs. In many ways, this is the one big reason, the one key reason why companies have been behaving the way they have in a number of areas. They're not just chopping employees right now because they've been told this is all just going to be a short-run mess. And once it gets sorted out, Everyone can all go back to the strong economy Jay Powell was talking about before the trade wars rudely interrupted everyone's success. And if you go back last week, Delta Airlines, when it reported on its quarterly results, the first of the air carriers to do so in the United States, they had finally said they're going to give guidance, and that kind of triggered this idea that maybe after what Delta said and what Delta was doing, that this all was going to be a short-lived phenomenon, that the downturn in discretionary spending was tied to fears over tariffs, and therefore once the tariffs themselves got sorted out and the fears dissipated, everyone would go back to traveling again. Consumers would go back to spending in the way they did before, and the entire economy would not have to suffer a substantial consumer downturn. As Reuters also reported last week from Delta, in the past few months, most U.S. airlines have pulled their 2025 financial forecasts in the wake of widespread consumer uncertainty, there's that term again, about how President Trump's tariff policies might ripple out. This pushed down bookings, a key metric in the airline business, and they're trying to say that it was uncertainty about tariffs that pushed down bookings, not consumers have no money, they're afraid for their jobs, and so they're pulling back on spending in a quite understandable fashion that has little to do with tariffs, it has everything to do with employment. But in its pre-market report last Thursday, Delta managed to notch a turnaround story, announcing that bookings had stabilized. In addition, it said premium ticket revenue was up 5% year over year, and loyalty program revenue was up 8% year over year, even though, then they bury it way down here at the bottom, standard main cabin fare revenue slid. In other words, they got some positives out there. Bookings seem to stabilize, which stabilizing at a low level isn't all that great. And revenue in the category where they get most of the revenue, the category that applies to most consumers, main cabin fares, was down. Everyone focused on the positive because that's what the stock market wanted to hear. But what Delta really said is some of the bad aspects that we were hoping to avoid are actually still happening. Before we get to the rest of today's video, we do have more of our Eurodollar University anniversary sale coming up. The webinar was only the first part of it. We'll have sales on the subscriptions to the membership and the daily briefing. Plus, we're also launching a brand new subscription over at Substack. Those details will be available at our website, eurodollar.university. We'll have more to say here on YouTube as well, but stay tuned for all of that. We saw that again yesterday in the consumer price report from the BLS for the month of June. Again, 3 months after tariffs and all the rigmarole in the financial economy, the stock market, and everything else. Here we are in the month of June, and consumer prices, by and large, show no impact from tariffs. While the media has overhyped the small little details where we do see some tariff impact, the overall CPI shows, especially the core rate, and especially these numbers related to what we're talking about here, discretionary spending, it's the exact opposite. So in that CPI report, as I talked about yesterday, it was weakness in hotel prices that were serious enough to have dented even the shelter index in the CPI. While the fake OER number, part of the shelter index, remained steady, the overall cost of shelter, according to the BLS, rose at the slowest pace since February 2021 because of how weak lodging prices were in June. The hotels and motels component was down 3.7% on the month, 2 months after hotel companies were saying they were hoping things were already starting to turn around. And it was the same for airlines. Transportation services costs in the CPI were only slightly positive, just up 0.16% on the month, after being down huge in February, March when all this kicked off. They rebounded only a little bit in April before declining again in May. So overall, transportation services, which includes airlines and a whole bunch of others, are down for the 5-month period. And that right there in consumer prices aligns with what Delta was saying about the lower revenue in their main cabin fares. There's weak purchasing power, therefore weak pricing all across the discretionary parts of the consumer economy. But now the PPI comes out today, and guess what it shows? The same weakness on the wholesale level as with consumer prices, despite the fact that we're 5 months into tariffs being implemented against all the U.S.'s biggest trading partners. Producer prices, they weren't just weak, they were actually negative. And they weren't just actually negative, they were unusually negative. You've got outright deflation in places like hotels and any business which is heavily exposed to consumer discretionary spending. First off, the PPI index overall, the whole thing, rose by just 0.01%, basically zero on the month, well below expectations. And that followed a 0.3% increase in May, but before May there had been 2 straight months of declines. That means the entire PPI, the full producer price index for the United States, is down by 0.1% during this 4-month period where tariffs are the biggest factor in inflation according to the media. It's not coming out in producer prices in the same way it's not coming out in consumer prices. Economists say inflation, so you're almost pretty much guaranteed that the opposite's going to happen, and the opposite is happening, and the real story is why it's not happening. As even Bloomberg said, U.S. wholesale inflation moderated in June as a sharp decline in the cost of travel-related services blunted a pickup in goods prices. And even that overstates it. Most of the pickup in goods prices was in energy, especially gasoline and natural gas, electricity production. Those didn't increase because of tariffs or inflation or even the economy. Much of it was because of the conflict in the Middle East and the bombing of Iran. So even where there was positive price pressures, it wasn't because of all of the factors that have been cited. Instead, we see more and more evidence and more strong evidence of weakness, lack of pricing power among businesses, whether they're selling to consumers or to other businesses. They can't find any demand because here in June, through the first half of the year, it is non-existent. In fact, it's non-existent to the point that it argues and points toward some substantial change in the overall condition of the economy, starting with the always or previously dependable consumers and their discretionary spending. So if you look at part of the PPI, which some economists and observers take as even more influential than just the core PPI, but the so-called core rate, which is the producer price index excluding food, energy, and trade services, that one was negative. And this is highly unusual because this part of the PPI, this measure of the PPI, is basically meant to survey the underlying price conditions in the overall producer economy in a way that leads to relatively steady price changes. It's not supposed to rise rapidly except in cases where there's really something going on in the economy, and it's not really supposed to show negative signs unless there is something substantial which has changed to weaken pricing power among all of those providing these services as well as goods. So to see this index decline is already unusual, but as I pointed out a couple months ago, it had already declined the first time back in April. So now we've got 2 negatives in the core PPI within a space of 3 months, which is highly unusual. The 3-month change for that period is minus 0.1%, which is the first 3-month negative since June of 2020. In fact, the last and only times it was negative before June of 2020, in the middle of 2020, was back in 2015. Highly unusual for this part of the index, which is what most economists look for. And that rather than seeing tariff inflation, they're now seeing weakness and deflation. That's how much things have changed in the overall economy. And it's the same in the PPI core, which includes trade services prices. That one was down in the month of June as well. Also the second decline in 3 months, though. On a 3-month basis, the PPI core is very slightly positive, but even that's unusually weak too. And the reason is we're talking about here, producer price services. The services index in the PPI was down 0.14% in June after being up nearly 0.4% in May, sparking all of these fears over tariffs, and maybe this is the turnaround and everything, but nope, falls all over again in June after being down substantially back in April. So now you have PPI services that's also negative on a 3-month basis, and also for the first time since June of 2020. And half of the decline in this particular part of the index, in the services index, was from travel, hotels, airfares, and everything that we've been talking about here. For specifically traveler accommodation services, that part was down 4.1% on the month, while in wholesale airline passenger services, that index was down 2.7% in June. So we've got problems in discretionary consumer spending and also business spending too, that's filtering into those businesses and becoming outright deflation on the wholesale level here in the month of June when everything was supposed to be, at least most people had hoped, turning around because of trade deals, tariff delays, and a stock market re-risking at a near historic pace. As I've said, the data in the macroeconomy, however, keeps showing that this was not a one-off. It was not specifically related to only and exclusively sentiment, and that sentiment wasn't about tariff and trade fears or trade war fears. It was instead consumers reacting to conditions in the overall economy, their perceptions of jobs and incomes, which we also have hard data corroboration for that says the labor market is under substantial strain. And it may have inflected too. And it makes sense that we get all of these things together. So negative producer prices, weak consumer prices, no tariff inflation to speak of, all of which traces back to weakness in the economy over and above what we've seen and sadly become accustomed to over the past couple of years. Forgot how to grow, has suddenly remembered how to do something like even deflationary circumstances. And another hard data point that we got from the Energy Information Administration of the US government, which keeps track of flows of crude oil as well as gasoline in the real economy. Further weekly figures for specifically on gasoline supplied, which is a proxy for how much gasoline is actually used in the economy. What they showed for the latest week, which was the week of July 11th, the rate was 8.49 million barrels per day in the latest week, and about 8.99 million barrels per day as a 4-week average. That's well below where we saw last year the same week, the second week in July of 2024, which had been up around 8.78 million in the week and 9.14 on average. In fact, when you look at the seasonal swings in gasoline usage, this year is showing up to be materially weaker than even 2024, which wasn't good, or 2023, which wasn't good. In fact, you got to go all the way back to the summer of 2022 to see a weaker gasoline supplied average. And remember back in 2022, this was right after gasoline prices had soared to their supply shock highs. So the reason why gasoline usage in 2022 was as low as it was because of the huge increase in prices. That hasn't happened here. In fact, we've got the opposite condition where gasoline prices have softened really since the end of last year and stayed that way. I pointed that out all throughout the winter, how gasoline prices were well below where they should have been. They should have been picking up in the spring, and it never happened. And here you have the U.S. government telling you why that was. The reason why gasoline prices weren't picking up is because there's no additional demand, no heavy demand, no strong demand for gasoline. In fact, gasoline usage continues to fall off where it should be in this usual seasonal pace. It's largely the same in overall petroleum usage for everything up to including gasoline as well as distillates that go into something like jet fuel. The amount of petroleum that's supplied, again, a proxy for the amount of demand and the amount of oil that was actually used in the economy, for the latest week was an 8-week average around 20.1 million, which was slightly less than the same weeks last year and slightly less than the same weeks in 2023 and a little bit above what it had been in 2022. So you've got weakness in energy, you've got weakness in basically everywhere that consumer discretionary spending touches, to the point that we're getting outright deflationary conditions, not a one-off due to tariff fears and overreactions to trade wars. But the media, it's desperate to sell you tariff inflation. A lot of economists and central bankers are too. Jay Powell more than anyone. But it isn't happening. And the real story in all of this is why it's not happening. Hotel operators and airlines, they can tell you why. They all hoped this consumer slump would be on its way out the door by now. And even Delta last week sneakily tried to support that narrative by blatantly cherry-picking some of the stats. Management there were able to easily sell it to the stock market because the stock market wants to hear exactly that message. But the reality in the hard data, very, very different case. June wasn't the start of a turnaround. It's gone in completely the opposite direction. Prices are weak, especially for travel, because it is the most discretionary category for consumers out there. Weak prices are therefore confirming the shift in the consumer economy that we've been highlighting from the very beginning, how it's very real and it is very ongoing. Gasoline demand, noticeably down, fits right in with that. Consumers aren't pulling back on traveling because they're worried about tariffs. They're doing that and a whole bunch of other things all across the greater economy because they know that there's trouble in the job market, labor market, jobs, and incomes. But what's really causing discretionary spending and deflationary prices related to it is that consumers and therefore businesses understand that the trouble in employment may only be just getting started. Even the CPI hit 5, meaning 5 months into this tariff stuff, the tariff inflation that everybody's so sure is going to break out just isn't happened. Went over what the details were in the consumer price report in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.